I always give really thoughtful care into the decisions I make around my program.
Parliamentarians must follow the rules. I have followed the rules.
That Comcar bill for $1,000 to wait 8-10 hours, that's my weekly wage.
I understand that perfectly, and I understand where people are coming from.
They haven't broken the rules, perchance, but what they have done is broken community expectations.
Richard Ferguson is the Australian's Federal Parliamentary Press Gallery Bureau Chief, and we're talking about the entitlement scandal that's scooping up new politicians every day. Richard, it's all been about Anika Wells in the days leading up to this. She's the Minister for Sport and Communications. She's been flying her husband and children around the country on what are legitimate family reunion trips, according to her. She's self-referred herself for an audit to the independent auditor, but as journalists pointed out to her at a press conference on Wednesday, it's all going to be within the rules. Many of these trips were pre-approved by that independent auditor. So where are we going to end up?
Look, I think it depends, Claire, on how far this contagion spreads. Anika Wells has definitely been the most jaw-dropping of these revelations, constantly taking her husband to grand finals for the AFL, to Boxing Day tests, to F1. She's a bit of a cut above the rest when it comes to the outlandishness and the brazenness of some of these trips. But she's actually not among the most frequent of these flyers. That definitely in the Labour cabinet, at least, is Don Farrell, his trips with his wife and potentially other family members would accumulate in air miles to halfway towards the moon, which is quite extraordinary when you think about it. That's 3.7 times around the Earth. So that is how much. That's over 260 flights for Don Farrell's wife and potentially other family members. Poor old Anika Wells' husband didn't get to the moon, but he did get to go to the grand final, which might be better.
Don Farrell is the Minister for Trade and Tourism. So just like Anika Wells, he's got business reasons to be flying around the country. Yeah. You can sort of understand this idea of family reunion trips being fair enough when, as Anika Wells does, you have 3 children under the age of 8. But Don Farrell is 71 years old. The person who is flying around to join him is his wife. Is it really necessary for taxpayers to be funding that?
Well, it's extraordinary because Don Farrell's first statement to the Australian when we put questions to him about his use of family reunion travel was that this was a great system, and it was a system that helped young mothers and single parents and carers be in Parliament. And I was like, it's an extraordinary thing for Don Farrell to be standing up for young mothers and carers, considering he is the 71-year-old feared power broker. So feared they call him the Don Father. So, for him to kind of come out for the single mums and the carers, I thought was fantastic. This speaks again to the fact that Anika Wells and Don Farrell and some of these Green senators can argue that they were not in breach of the rules. And we've got to remember that this current system with this independent parliamentary expenses authority was set up because of Susan Lee's extraordinary flights to the Gold Coast that led her parting ways with Malcolm Turnbull's cabinet when she was the health minister, and then a whole new system had to be created by Malcolm Turnbull. So there is this contagion is going to spread from the Labour cabinet. It's already started, obviously, to the Greens, and I wouldn't be surprised if it goes further. Anika Wells, in particular, can say all she wants about what the rules are, what the guidelines are, but is this passing what we call the pub test? Is this meeting community expectations? I think she is really struggling to grapple with that.
The old classic scandal in politics used to be that you were a family values campaigner and that you were a nice Christian man, and it turned out you were having an affair with your secretary, and that was the great cliche. Now the cliche seems to be you're a left-wing politician, you come into Parliament with some kind of log cabin story, or either of your own of growing up in poverty with a single mother, or you're a member of a trade union like Don Farrell and you want to come into politics to help, as they say, working people get a fair crack of the whip. that's when it's particularly galling, isn't it? When Labor politicians and for example, the Greens, who talk a lot about social justice, about affordable housing, about the cost of living, put their snouts in the trough.
I think especially for the Greens, Claire, this has been very, very damaging. You know, they are in a very difficult position. They went quite significantly backwards in the election, obviously losing their leader, Adam Bant, in Melbourne to Labour. They've still got a balance of power in the Senate, but their position in the public, I think, is quite damaged. And for this now to affect them, you know, they're supposed to be the party of so-called integrity. And it turns out that they've been flying people to join them at protests and music festivals. And then we have the case of Ben Oakwist, the political lobbyist, former head of the Australia Institute. He is the husband of Sarah Hanson-Young, and he has taken multiple trips with Sarah Hanson-Young. We've calculated at the Australian that Sarah Hanson-Young has used family travel at least 81 times. You would imagine that Ben Oakwist is on quite a lot of those flights. In fact, one of the flights that we've logged for Sarah Hanson-Young's family reunion travel, on that date, Ben Oakwist was taking photos of coastlines from an airplane window. So that's interesting. So I think this is particularly very difficult with the Greens. And this is very difficult for the Labour Party. You know, this is the first time, especially with Anika Wells, that the Labour Party has been under sustained political pressure and not been in control of the narrative, I think, since the May election. I mean, without a doubt. And it's not over a policy issue where they can easily change course. This is a entire system which they all use.
Well, the independent agency is there, and just like I don't decide my salary, it's important that's done by the REM tribunal. It's important that there be distance between the decision makers and the management of it.
They do all use it, and over the years the argument has been that really they don't earn that much, that they could all be earning a lot more if they were in corporate Australia. Now that's changed. Cabinet ministers are now earning somewhere around $400,000. Even lowly backbenchers and junior ministers are earning, well over 180 grand into the 200,000s. It's all a bit fluid because you add in entitlements and electorate office expenses and all that sort of stuff to their salaries. But I wonder, though, Richard, do you think many of these people would actually make it in corporate Australia? Or are they this kind of sheltered class of people who don't really get what it's like out there in the private sector?
I think there are some examples of obviously people who have done very well when they've left Parliament. You think of people like Josh Frydenberg at Goldman Sachs. You think of Peter Costello up until a point at Channel 9. You think of Matthias Cormann, obviously, in a huge job at the OECD, which he's done incredibly well, so well that he's been reappointed. But most politicians find it very difficult to transition into ordinary life, which was one reason why there was such a generous parliamentary pension until it was finally kind of killed off by John Howard in order to keep Mark Latham at bay around the 2004 election. And, we see this with our own former prime ministers all the time. And, they get their own offices, their own cars, they get a lot of entitlements. But as we all know, and especially in this country, Julia Gillard, former prime ministers find it very hard not to cause trouble and to make their voices heard. Because, an MP once said to me, Claire, when we were talking about people like Kevin Rudd and Malcolm Turnbull, it must be very hard to get over having been the leader of your country. And I think for a lot of MPs, they find it very hard to have been the MP for their electorate or a minister, or potentially they could have been prime minister. I think there is a disconnect there. I think there are quite a lot of people, a lot of them who think, well, I would be a very successful CEO, would they? I mean, a lot of these people are coming straight, especially in the Labour Party, are coming straight from the union pipeline. And in the Liberal Party, a lot of them now are coming straight from the staffer pipeline, or the think tank pipeline. So the idea that, that they could all become CEOs and, They're doing it much tougher than CEOs. I think the public find that quite galling.
We saw a controversy earlier in 2025 about politicians having access to the Chairman's Lounge, a special Qantas club that only very, very, very VIPs can get into. In UK politics as well, Richard, the Labor government of Keir Starmer really mired itself in its first months in government by revelations that they'd been accepting freebies from ultra-rich donors, including clothes and access to houses. Keir Starmer lost one of his closest allies, Angela Rayner, to a scandal over her sort of second properties. Do you think we're moving in a direction in politics in Australia and the UK, kind of the Anglosphere, where all of this is kind of going to stop, that there will end up being very, very strict rules that mean it's just not worth it to do this kind of thing anymore? Or not? Is it going somewhere else?
I'm not so sure about that, Claire, because even just looking at Australian history, Bob Hawke lost lots of ministers kind of to very high ministerial standards. And then famously, John Howard was constantly losing ministers, as you know, having covered the early Howard years, Claire. He was losing ministers constantly to high ministerial standards, and essentially he had to stop because it wasn't working. Anthony Albanese definitely is not in a mood to move Anika Wells. He values Anika Wells very highly. He's very close to Anika Wells. She's obviously, in charge of the unveiling the social media ban, the world-leading social media ban for under 16s. And he does not want to give an inch. He doesn't want to give an inch. And he definitely is not going to give an inch to Don Farrell, who's his deputy Senate leader and one of the most powerful power brokers in the Labour right. Maybe the last great power broker of the Labour right. So is anyone going to get sacked from this scandal? I'm not particularly sure of that, but I definitely think it has maybe not been the end of the Albanese second term honeymoon, but it's definitely the beginning of the end of the Albanese second term honeymoon. They're now heading into a 2026 where they don't have an election for quite a while, but we are facing 2 potential interest rate hikes, an economy that is very uncertain, Donald Trump facing a wipeout in the midterm elections, and who knows what that's going to do to him. We're still not clear what's happening between him and Xi Jinping and what that will mean for regional security in Taiwan in particular, especially as we come up to that 2027 deadline for Xi Jinping. It's going to be a much more uncertain 2026 for Anthony Albanese than it was in 2025, and perhaps this particular saga of entitlements has reminded the Prime Minister that maybe it really was as good as it gets for him, and things might be even tougher despite his massive 94-seat majority and a Liberal Party which is basically useless.
On the eve of the election, have you sold out your environment credentials for a rotten, stinking extinction salmon? Extinction salmon.
Just back to the Greens for a moment, Richard, because this is such a great story. Sarah Hanson-Young, who is the spokeswoman for the arts in the Greens Party, has billed taxpayers to attend festivals, and including her accommodation and tickets to those festivals, where she was making some sort of announcement about, surprise, surprise, the Greens supporting festivals.
Mm-hmm.
She's also flying her husband, Ben Oquist, who is a respected long-time former Greens staffer. He was a prominent staffer to, the kind of patron saint of the Greens, Bob Brown, for many, many years. Now he's a lobbyist. So as the Greens have moved away from the environmental focus of leaders like Bob Brown and moved towards social justice and integrity and issues like that, this becomes a very acute issue, doesn't it, for Sarah Hanson-Young?
I think it's a very acute issue for Sarah Hanson-Young and Maureen Faruqi for flying around her family members to join her anti-Israel protests, and where she's often next to very unsavoury characters. That, they claim to be the party of integrity. They claim to be the party of, a stronger National Anti-Corruption Commission, bringing down the rich, all of this nonsense. And here they're as bad as anyone. They're as bad as anyone. Once again, they haven't broken the rules perchance, but what they have done is broken community expectations, and probably the even higher expectations their own voters would have for them, considering they've sold themselves as, you know, the squeaky clean Greens.
Richard Ferguson is the Australian's Canberra Bureau Chief. Thanks, Richard.
Thanks, Claire.